Welcome back to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Today is episode 8 of A through Z of Haunted America, a series where we explore the strange, eerie, and mysterious corners of America. Delaware is rarely the state people expect to be haunted. It's small, easy to overlook, often described as quiet, boring, and uneventful. A place you pass through rather than arrive at. When people think of haunted America, they imagine towering prisons, massive battlefields, or cities built on spectacle and tragedy. Delaware doesn't fit that image. And that's exactly why it works. Because when a place is considered unimportant, its history isn't examined closely. Loss doesn't get cataloged. Death doesn't get remembered. It gets minimized, relocated, or paved over. Delaware's hauntings don't announce themselves. They blend in. They hide in marshland, along back roads, in military sites, and forgotten towns that never made it into textbooks. This is a state shaped by war that moved through quickly, by coastal deaths that left no bodies behind, and by communities that disappeared without ceremony. Shipwrecks where names were never recovered. Prison camps where survival was never expected. Burial grounds that were quietly relocated or not relocated at all. Nothing here feels theatrical. And that's the point. The hauntings that persist in Delaware aren't loud or interactive. They don't perform. They repeat. Footsteps in empty places. Lights where there shouldn't be any. Figures seen just long enough to make you question whether you were supposed to notice them at all. The theme of this episode is simple. Things buried shallow. Histories that were never meant to resurface. Deaths that were documented poorly or not at all. Places where the ground remembers more than the people do. In Delaware, the land doesn't scream its past. It hums. And if you stay long enough, you can hear it. Delaware's history doesn't unfold in grand scenes. It happens in transit. During the colonial period and the Revolutionary War, Delaware wasn't a destination. It was a corridor. Troops moved through it. Supplies passed along its roads and waterways. Battles were brief, violent, and often undocumented. Soldiers died far from where they enlisted, and many were buried where they fell, marked hastily or not at all. When the war moved on, the land stayed. That pattern repeats during the Civil War. Delaware doesn't host sprawling battlefields, but it did house something arguably worse. Places where people were kept, confined, and left to deteriorate. Prison camps where disease spread faster than records were kept. Where survival wasn't expected, and death didn't always warrant a name. At places like Fort Delaware, thousands passed through under conditions that guaranteed suffering. Overcrowding, malnutrition, exposure. Bodies were buried quickly, sometimes improperly, sometimes collectively. The goal wasn't remembrance, it was efficiency. That kind of death doesn't announce itself later. It lingers. Along the coast, the story changes, but the results are the same. Delaware's waterways were working routes for fishing, shipping, and industry. Shipwrecks were common. Storms erased vessels and crews without ceremony. Some bodies washed ashore. Many didn't. Names were lost to tides. Logs went missing. And families were left without confirmation. A body that's never recovered is never fully accounted for. Then there are the cemeteries. Burial grounds relocated for roads, developments, or convenience. Graves moved incompletely. Headstones separated from remains. Older family plots absorbed by farmland, then forgotten. In some cases, records exist, but no one checks them. In others, the records were never kept at all. What's important here is not scandal. It's repetition. Delaware's dead were often unseen, uncounted, or quietly handled. There were no monuments, no public reckonings, just land that absorbed over and over, without pause. That's why the hauntings here don't feel intentional. They don't interact. They don't perform. They repeat. Footsteps where corridors once mattered. Lights near water where someone waited to be found. Figures passing through spaces that were never meant to hold people for long. This is death without witness. And without witnesses, history doesn't close cleanly. It echoes. If there is one place in Delaware where the haunting is undeniable, it's Fort Delaware. Not because of a single story, not because of a famous apparition, but because of volume and consistency. During the Civil War, Fort Delaware functioned as a prison camp. At its peak, it held thousands of Confederate soldiers in conditions that were never designed for long-term survival. Overcrowding was extreme. Disease spread rapidly. Food was scarce. Exposure was constant. Men weakened quickly, and many didn't leave alive. Death here wasn't dramatic. It was routine. Bodies were removed efficiently. Burials were rushed. Records were incomplete. The goal was containment, not care. What mattered was keeping people in, not making sure they were remembered afterward. That matters when we talk about people's experience here now. Reports from Fort Delaware span decades and come from visitors, historians, park rangers, and maintenance staff. The stories don't change much over time, which is unusual. There's no escalation, no embellishment, just repetition. Footsteps echoing through empty cell blocks when no one else is present. Not running, not dragging, walking, steady, paced, and deliberate. Voices calling out from sealed rooms, sometimes sounding like roll call responses, sometimes like someone asking for help. Shadow figures seen along the walls, especially in peripheral vision, moving in patterns that mirror how prisoners once paced their confinement. What's notable is who reports these encounters. Not tourists, not ghost hunters, staff members, people who know the layout, the acoustics, the normal sounds of the island. Rangers who have worked there for years and still avoid certain areas alone, especially after hours. Experiences reported when the fort is closed, secure, and silent. The energy here is often described the same way: watchful. Not hostile, not aggressive, aware. People don't feel chased. They feel observed, as if movement is being tracked, not threatened. As if the space still expects occupancy and is unsettled when it's empty. And that's the key distinction. Fort Delaware doesn't feel like one spirit trapped in one moment. It doesn't behave like a story that ends badly and replayed itself once. It feels populated, as though the fort never fully transitioned out of its original purpose. Cells are empty, but not unoccupied. Corridors are silent, but not unused. This isn't a ghost. It's a remaining presence of thousands of people who were never meant to leave together, and never did. If Fort Delaware feels occupied, Cape Henlopen feels activated. This isn't a place known for a single apparition or a defined ghost story. What keeps Cape Henlopen near the top of Delaware's reported encounters is repetition. Unexplained phenomena that appear, disappear, and then return under nearly identical circumstances. The most common reports involve light. Small, distant glows appearing near former military installations, sometimes hovering, sometimes moving laterally, as if following a route. They aren't consistent with aircraft, boats, or nearby towns. They appear in areas that are supposed to be dark, and then vanish without transition. People who see them often wait for an explanation that never comes. Then there are the shadow figures. Seen along certain paths and wooded edges, usually at dusk or just after dark, not fully formed, more like interruptions in the landscape, a vertical absence where something should be visible. They don't approach. They don't react to being noticed. They move with purpose, and then they're gone. What many witnesses mention, more than anything else, is the silence. A sudden drop in ambient sound. No insects, no wind, no distant water. Just a brief, unnatural quiet that settles in and makes people stop walking without knowing why. It doesn't last long, but it's consistent enough that locals recognize it when it happens. Cape Henlopen's history matters here. The land was used heavily during wartime. Restricted zones, coastal defenses, military patrols, and beyond that, the water itself has taken lives. Swimmers, sailors, people pulled under and never recovered. Not every death was witnessed. Not every body was found. The result isn't a haunting that intersects. It's a presence that observes. Locals often describe the feeling the same way. Not fear, not danger, awareness. Like something is noting your position, not deciding to act, just registering that you're there. And that's what makes Cape Henlopen different. It doesn't feel abandoned. It feels like a system that was shut down improperly. Something about the land remembers when it had a purpose, when movement was constant, when watching mattered, And now, even though structures are gone and the signs have changed, whatever was built in its place doesn't fully power down. It waits, it monitors, and then it goes quiet. Some hauntings survive because they're flashy. Others survive because they're useful. Ellendale falls into the second category. For generations, people driving the royal roads around Ellendale have reported the same figure: a body moving without a head, not appearing suddenly, not materializing for effect, just there, standing near the road, crossing it, or keeping pace beside a vehicle just long enough to be noticed. And then it's gone. What keeps this story alive isn't how frightening it sounds, it's how little it changes. Witnesses describe the same accompanying details, no matter the decade. Cars stalling or losing power without warning, headlights dimming, radios cutting out, a sudden, overwhelming sense of disorientation, as if the road has shifted or stretched. People missing turns they've taken their entire lives. The most unsettling of all is the feeling that follows. Not being watched, being chased. Drivers describe the instinct to accelerate, even when they don't fully understand why. A pressure in their chest, hands tightening on the wheel, the certainty that stopping would be a mistake, even though there's no clear threat visible in the mirror. Unlike many roadside legends, the Ellendale figure doesn't invite interaction. It doesn't gesture. It doesn't approach. It doesn't follow once the vehicle has passed a certain point. It appears, and then it releases you. That's why locals don't talk about it like a ghost story. They talk about it like a warning. Something that shows up when conditions are wrong, late nights, empty streets, fatigue, distraction, people who aren't fully present. The figure doesn't seem interested in being seen. It seems interested in making sure you keep moving. This isn't a performance ghost. It doesn't want witnesses. It doesn't want belief. It wants distance. And the reason the story refuses to die is simple. The people who encounter it don't come away with a story to tell. They come away with the same conclusion. Whatever that presence is, it's not there for them. It's there to make sure they leave. Along Delaware's coast and marshland, people have been seeing lights for generations. Not lanterns, not boats, not anything that behaves the way a light should. They appear as distant glows, sometimes steady, sometimes pulsing, often low to the ground or just above the waterline. They're most commonly reported along isolated stretches of coast and tidal marsh, especially near Delaware Bay, where land and water blur and distances are hard to judge. Official explanations exist. They always have. Marsh gas, atmospheric conditions, optical illusions caused by temperature aversion or reflection. Each explanation works, briefly, until you hear the rest of the reports. Locals describe lights as moving with intention, not drifting, not flickering randomly, traveling laterally, stopping, changing direction, sometimes appearing in a place where a light was seen years earlier and nowhere else. People who approach them rarely reach them. The lights fade, shifts, or disappears entirely, only to reappear further away. Sometimes behind the observer, sometimes along a different stretch of land altogether. The pattern isn't random, but it isn't predictable either. What's notable is where these lights tend to appear. Near former burial grounds that were relocated incompletely, or not at all. Near known shipwreck zones where bodies were never recovered. Near waterways tied to labor, transport, and wartime movement where deaths were common and documentation was poor. The consistency doesn't claim these lights are ghosts. It claims they're markers. That they appear where something is missing, where remains were never properly recorded, never identified, or never acknowledged. Bodies lost to water, graves displaced for progress, deaths absorbed into paperwork without names. The theory is simple, and that's what makes it unsettling. If these lights are tied to unaccounted remains, then explaining them away isn't just about science. It's about liability. About admitting how many people died without record. How much history was quietly erased because it was inconvenient to preserve. In that framing, the lights aren't supernatural warnings. They're reminders. Not of danger, but of debt. This isn't a monster story, and it isn't a hoax. It's the suggestion that something keeps surfacing because it was never properly buried, and that the land is still keeping count, even if no one else does. When you step back from individual stories, Delaware's hauntings begin to look less like isolated incidents and more like a pattern. Across the state, encounters rarely involve interaction. People aren't spoken to directly. They aren't touched. They aren't chased through buildings or confronted with messages from the dead. What they experience is quieter and stranger. Repetition. The same footsteps heard in the same corridors, the same lights appearing along the same stretches of land, the same figures crossing the same roads at nearly identical points in time. Movement without engagement. Something passes through a space the way it always has, regardless of who is present. Shadow figures that don't react to being noticed. Presences that continue along their path, whether someone is watching or not. And sound without a source. Voices where no one is standing. Walking where no one is moving. Doors, wind, and water where the environment doesn't support it. Sounds don't demand attention. They just exist, briefly, and then they stop. Taken together, these details suggest something important. Delaware's hauntings don't behave like conscious spirits. They don't feel aware of the present moment. They don't adapt. They don't respond. They repeat. This points less towards intelligence and more towards imprint. Residual trauma rather than intentional haunting. Moments recorded into place and replayed under the right conditions. Not because something chooses to appear, but because something was never released. In Delaware, the land does the remembering. marshes that absorb bodies and never return them, islands that held people in confinement until death became routine, roads laid over burial grounds and forgotten settlements. The ground here has been asked to carry a lot, quietly, efficiently, without witnesses. And when history doesn't process loss properly, it doesn't disappear. It settles. That may be why so many experiences in Delaware feel observational rather than confrontational. As if the land is replaying what it once held, not for an audience, but because it doesn't know how to stop. The hauntings don't ask for belief. They don't ask for fear. They simply occur over and over again. Delaware doesn't scream. It hums. Not with the kind of clamor people expect from haunted places, but with a low, persistent resonance. A murmur carried across marshland, through abandoned roads, along the edges of old prisons and coastal waters. A place that keeps its memories in silence. It is a state where history wasn't dramatic enough to memorialize, but too violent to forget. Battles moved quickly. Prisoners died quietly. Bodies disappeared into water, into marsh, into earth that no one cared to mark. Communities were erased, cemeteries relocated, and yet the land remembers. And so the hauntings followed that pattern. Footsteps in empty hallways, lights that appear and vanish, shadows that move without intention, sounds that are never sourced. What happens when no one was watching and no one wrote it down? What lingers when history passes by and leaves nothing but space? Delaware holds those spaces. It holds the people who never left, the deaths that were never recorded, the grief that never found a voice. And in that quiet, persistent way, it hums. No shrieks, no grand displays, no spectacle, just the weight of remembrance that refuses to fade. And if you listen carefully, you can feel it. A quiet echo of lives lived, lost, and never fully accounted for. If you have an encounter that lingers in the quiet hum of Delaware's marshes, or a presence that refuses to be forgotten, send it my way. You might hear it on a future episode. You can submit your stories to hexes, haunts, and howls at gmail.com. Again, that's hexes, haunts, and howls, all one word, at gmail.com. All stories will remain anonymous. Thank you for listening to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Until next time, stay sweet.